It begins as many scandals do not in the streets, but in the corridors, where power is traded like gold. Rome, proud, disciplined, and ruthless, was a city built on the iron of its legions and the dignity of its men. And yet beneath the marble arches and Senate steps, rumors flowed like sewage through the back alleys. And no rumor was more poisonous than this, that Julius Caesar, the man who would one day wear a crown in everything but name, had once been the willing lover of another king. Not a Roman, not even a man of equal standing, but Nicomedes, the fourth ruler of distant Bithynia, a kingdom of perfume-thick air, embroidered silks, and a throne that stood only because Rome allowed it to. They say Caesar was young, then sent east on a mission that should have been routine. But in the glittering halls of Nicomedes' court, where music lingered in the shadows, and every gesture could be a trap, something happened. Something his enemies would later twist into the most humiliating accusation a Roman man could face, that he had surrendered not just his body, but his honor. For in Rome, a man could take lovers. He could take men even. But to be taken, to be the one on the receiving end, was to be marked forever. No victory, no speech, no triumphal parade could fully wash that stain away. And so from the moment the story was born, it lived. It clung to Caesar's name through wars, through conquests, through the Senate's applause, and its daggers. But was it truth, or a weapon crafted in the shadows? To find the answer, we must go back before Caesar was Caesar, to the heat and intrigue of Bithynia, to the moment where a boy chasing glory stepped into a court that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Long before the whispers, before the Senate's mocking jests and political cartoons etched into tavern walls, Bithynia was a jewel set in the eastern crown of the Mediterranean. It was not Rome; its streets did not echo with the stomp of disciplined legions, but with the lazy shuffle of servants carrying trays of figs and honeyed wine. Its markets smelled of saffron and cinnamon, not iron and sweat. The coastline curved like a crescent of turquoise, where merchant ships swayed heavy with silk's glass and exotic animals that Rome's cold marble had never seen. But beauty in the ancient world was never free. Beneath the perfumes and painted facades, Bithynia was a kingdom hanging by a thread. Surrounded by ambitious neighbors and squeezed by Rome's shadow, its king Nicomedes IV played a delicate game. To survive, he had to charm, flatter, and sometimes kneel to those whose armies could trample his throne in a week. And Nicomedes? He was no ordinary monarch. He was a man who understood the art of theater, of turning the court into a stage. His robes shimmered with gold thread embroidery, his halls dripped with marble and colored glass, and his feasts were legendary, where poets recited verses between courses, and dancers swayed in the candlelight, until even seasoned Roman envoys forgot their mission. It was into this world, a world both intoxicating and dangerous, that a young Julius Caesar arrived. He was no conqueror, yet no dictator, no name carved into the bones of history. He was ambitious, yes, but green, a minor official, sent on an errand Rome thought beneath its notice. And Nicomedes saw him. History doesn't record their first words. It doesn't tell us if it was politics, admiration, or something else entirely that drew them together. But the moment Caesar stepped into those gilded halls, the trajectory of his life shifted ever so slightly, like a ship changing course. And that shift would give his enemies a weapon sharp enough to draw blood for decades to come. When Julius Caesar first crossed the threshold of Nicomedes' palace, he stepped into a world that seemed designed to disarm him. The air inside was perfumed with crushed jasmine and burning myrrh, thick enough to dull the sharp edges of Roman austerity. Light poured through colored glass, staining the marble floor in shades of ruby and emerald. Every detail whispered of a kingdom that did not simply exist. It performed. Caesar had been raised to believe that discipline was Rome's lifeblood. Men of standing kept their emotions on a tight leash. Their words measured their pleasures hidden behind closed doors. Yet here the rules seemed different. Servants in flowing linen moved like dancers. Musicians strummed delicate lyres between conversations. And in the center of it all was Nicomedes, draped in purple and gold, watching the young Roman with an unreadable expression. Their first exchange was formal diplomatic greetings, ritualized politeness, but beneath the words there was a subtle contest of wills. Nicomedes, the seasoned ruler, gauged the measure of the youth before him. Caesar, barely past 20, tried to appear unimpressed, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. It was not just the king's opulence that intrigued him. It was his command of the room, the way every glance, every gesture seemed to draw the air toward him. Nicomedes did not need to raise his voice to hold power. It was woven into his very presence. That night after the official banquet, the two spoke privately. The subject, at least on the surface, was the fleet Rome wanted from Bithynia. But as the hours slipped by, the conversation wandered, touching on philosophy, military ambition, and the fragile balance of life between empires. The king's words were laced with hints of vulnerability and veiled invitation, a dangerous blend for an ambitious young Roman who had never been this close to such intoxicating influence. By dawn, the foundations of a relationship, political, personal, or both, had been laid. Neither man could know that this bond, however brief, would echo through history, transformed by gossip, sharpened by malice, and weaponized by Caesar's enemies for the rest of his life. In Bithynia, walls had ears, and in the marble corridors of Nicomedes' palace, silence was never truly empty. It was filled with the rustle of silk, the scrape of sandals, and the quickened breaths of servants who knew when to linger just long enough to overhear. The morning after Caesar's private audience with Nicomedes, the first whispers began. No one knew exactly what had transpired, but the image of the young Roman leaving the king's private chambers, eyes bright from long conversation, was enough to spark curiosity. In a court where intrigue was the currency of survival, the truth mattered less than the story people could tell. Some said the meeting was nothing more than strategic diplomacy, a negotiation for ships and men. Others, those with sharper tongues, suggested the king's interest in the Roman went beyond politics. And in the courts of the ancient world, such speculation was like oil on fire. Caesar, still green in the art of palace survival, underestimated how swiftly an unguarded moment could become a weapon. Nicomedes, on the other hand, had spent decades navigating the perilous waters of both politics and rumor. He seemed unbothered, even amused when fragments of conversation reached his ears. For a man who ruled by charisma as much as by force, a hint of scandal was hardly a disadvantage, at least within his own walls. But for Caesar, the stakes were different. Every murmur was a potential dagger aimed at his reputation in Rome, where whispers of indulgence or moral weakness could tarnish a career before it began. Yet in those early days, he didn't pull away. Perhaps it was the magnetic pull of Nicomedes' attention, or perhaps the intoxicating sensation of being seen not merely as a guest, but as an equal. In that palace of gleaming columns and shadowed alcoves, the line between ally and liability blurred, and somewhere in the unlit corners, a new narrative began to take root, one that would follow Caesar for decades, twisting with every retelling until it became almost indistinguishable from the truth. The night was heavy with the scent of roasted lamb and spiced wine. Torches burned high along the palace's banquet hall, their flames flickering against the polished bronze of serving trays. The king of Bithynia had summoned his court for an evening of celebration, but in truth the feast was never just about food, it was about theater. Tables groaned under the weight of honeyed figs, grilled fish, and pyramids of fresh bread. Musicians plucked at lyres while dancers moved like ribbons of fire between the guests. And at the center of it all sat Nicomedes, his smile carrying both warmth and calculation. Caesar was placed close to the king, an honor in itself, but also a spotlight he could not step out of. Every glance between them, every shared laugh was noted by the room. In a court where proximity to power was both privilege and peril, that closeness did not go unnoticed. As the night deepened, cups were refilled again and again. Wine loosened tongues, and the air grew thick with laughter and half-spoken insinuations. At one point, Nicomedes leaned toward Caesar, speaking low enough for only him to hear a private remark that drew a sudden smile from the Roman. It lasted just a heartbeat, but in that moment, the hall seemed to pause. Some guests exchanged knowing looks. Others smirked, already rehearsing the words they would whisper later in shaded corridors. The performance was complete not because of what was said, but because of what could be imagined. The feast, like all good political games, ended not with a clear resolution, but with seeds sown. Seeds of loyalty, perhaps. Seeds of scandal, certainly. Caesar would leave the table that night. With more than a full stomach, he carried with him a reputation that was beginning to crystallize, shaped as much by perception as by truth. And in the torchlight of Nicomedes' hall, those perceptions would spread long after the last goblet was drained. Long after the last guest had stumbled away from the banquet, the palace fell into a hushed stillness. The laughter and clinking cups had faded, leaving only the low crackle of braziers and the faint smell of wine on the air. In this quiet, the games of the evening were not over. They were simply moving to another stage. Caesar was summoned not publicly, but through the discreet gesture of a servant who knew better than to speak aloud. The path to Nicomedes' private chambers was lined with shadows, and each torch seemed to burn lower the closer he came. Inside, the king was no longer the smiling host. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were fixed sharp with purpose. Between them, a small table bore a map of the Aegean weighted down at the corners with carved figurines. Ships, fortresses, routes. It was not a night for idle conversation. Bithynia was facing a crisis, one that demanded allies, not flatterers. In exchange for assistance, Rome required certain assurances. And here was the unspoken truth. Diplomacy was never conducted entirely on paper. Influence could be bought in silver and soldiers, or in trust so personal it could not be faked. What exactly passed between them, in that room history, never recorded in detail. Perhaps it was only a frank negotiation between two leaders. Perhaps there was more a weaving together of ambition and intimacy, as dangerous as it was binding. What is known is that when Caesar left those chambers, the alliance was sealed. The terms were not written in the public record, but the consequences were. Rome's grip on Bithynia tightened. Caesar's position in Nicomedes' court deepened. And with it, the whispers began to grow teeth. But for Caesar, the decision was not about the gossip of senators. It was about survival and momentum. He understood better than most that power was never taken all at once. It was gathered like coins dropped into an unseen purse until the weight became undeniable. And tonight, behind closed doors, another coin had fallen. At first, the whispers moved like smoke, thin, elusive, slipping between marble columns and over polished floors. Servants carried them in their glances, merchants in their half-finished sentences. Even the most disciplined soldier could not resist the temptation of repeating what he had overheard near the palace gates. It began innocently enough talk of the Roman envoy, who seemed unusually close to the Bithynian king. A shared table here, a private ride through the hills there. Harmless, perhaps, until harmlessness became unlikely. In the rigid world of Roman politics, perception was often more powerful than truth. Men could survive betrayal, defeat, even outright treason, so long as their dignity remained intact. But to be whispered about in ways that threatened one's masculinity, that could be political death. The senators back in Rome were vultures circling over rumors. Reports arrived of Caesar's extended stay in Nicomedes' court. Why had a routine diplomatic mission taken so long? Why had he been seen in the king's private quarters on multiple occasions? Each retelling became sharper, more scandalous. embroidered with details no witness could confirm but many claimed to know. By the time the gossip reached the forum, it had transformed into an accusation that Caesar had not merely negotiated with Nicomedes, but had submitted to him. It was a calculated insult laced with venom. In Roman culture, to be the dominant partner in a relationship, whether with a man or a woman, carried no shame. But to be the submissive, that was to be stripped of honor status and the respect of one's peers. And so the scandal was born not from documented fact, but from the intoxicating blend of envy, rivalry, and Rome's own obsession with power dynamics in the bedroom. For Caesar, these were not idle taunts. They were the first volley in a war of reputation, a war where truth mattered less than the sharpness of the rumor, and where each echo could chip away at the foundations he had worked so carefully to build. Caesar had faced enemies with swords and spears. He had commanded legions across blood-soaked fields where victory was tangible, measurable, undeniable. But now, his most dangerous battle could not be fought with steel. It was fought in the shadows against a whisper that refused to die. The rumor about Nicomedes was not just an insult, it was a weapon. Every time it was repeated in the forum in the Senate or in the smoky corners of Rome's taverns, it stripped away another layer of his authority. His opponents knew this. They didn't need to prove anything, they just needed to keep the fire smoldering. Caesar understood that to defend himself too loudly would only make the accusation seem more believable. To ignore them entirely would let his enemies define him. He had to strike a balance, a precise, calculated counterattack. In public speeches, he began weaving subtle jabs into his rhetoric, mocking the absurdity of the claims without dignifying them as serious charges. On campaign, he drowned gossip under the weight of his accomplishments, new alliances, decisive victories, acts of generosity that won him both soldiers' loyalty and the people's affection. But the whispers were stubborn. They clung to him, resurfacing whenever a political rival needed a quick weapon. In Rome's brutal political theater, even the faintest suggestion of weakness could be fatal. And so Caesar adapted. He turned the scandal into a joke at his own expense, delivered with just enough charm to make others laugh with him instead of at him. By robbing the insult of its sting, he began to control the narrative. Still deep down, he knew the stain would never fully fade. Rome had a long memory, and certain rumors, no matter how baseless, had the power to survive generations. What mattered now was ensuring that when people remembered Julius Caesar, they would recall not a man broken by scandal, but one who rose above it and bent history to his will. The war for his reputation was far from over. But in this round at least, Caesar had landed a blow. Caesar had learned one of Rome's oldest political truths, the same fire that can burn. You can also light your path if you control it. The rumor about Nicomedes was poison, yes, but poison could be turned into a weapon. In private, he began to treat the scandal not as a curse, but as a test of loyalty. Those who laughed too loudly or repeated the jibe too freely revealed themselves as unreliable allies or worse enemies in disguise. Those who brushed it aside and stood firm proved their worth. The rumor became a political sieve, separating true friends from opportunists. On the battlefield of politics, Caesar even dared to weaponize the whisper. In the Senate, when rivals tried to undermine him with sly comments about the king of Bithynia, he would respond with quick wit, turning their mockery back on them in ways that made the crowd laugh at them instead. A sharp tongue, he realized, could cut deeper than any sword. But Caesar's greatest maneuver was more subtle. By leaning into the image of someone accused of foreign entanglements, he positioned himself as a man who understood the wider world, a leader not bound by narrow Roman prejudice. His years in the East, including his time at Nicomedes' court, became proof of his diplomatic skill, his ability to build alliances beyond Rome's borders. It was a gamble recasting the same story his enemies used against him, as evidence of his unique experience, and in time, it began to work. Among Rome's soldiers, merchants, and the growing number of provincials who saw themselves as part of the empire, Caesar's openness to foreign influence was a mark of modernity, not shame. What had once been an insult whispered in taverns was now part of a larger legend, a legend Caesar was shaping, with every calculated word, every public act, every victory. He had not erased the rumor. That was impossible. But he had done something far more powerful. He had made it serve him. Even as Caesar's star rose higher than any Roman before him, the shadow of Nicomedes never truly vanished. It clung to him like a faint scent, never overpowering, but always there, ready to be stirred by the faintest political breeze. When he returned from his conquest of Gaul, hailed as a hero, the Senate still had its jesters. Old rivals would slip the nickname Queen of Bithynia into speeches not as a serious charge anymore, but as a way to remind Rome that even the mightiest man could be reduced to a punchline. Caesar, ever the tactician, smiled when he heard it in public, but in private he never forgot that ridicule could erode authority just as surely as defeat in battle. The truth was simple: Rome never let go of its stories. In a city built on memory, where every triumphal arch was carved to immortalize a victory, rumors were monuments too only invisible, carved into the minds of men. But Caesar had long since made peace with it. In his own eyes, the Nicomedes scandal was no longer a wound, but a scar, a visible mark of survival. He had endured Rome's laughter and Rome's venom, and he had turned both to his advantage. And yet in the quieter hours, perhaps he knew there was a price. The whispers had taught him that power was never absolute, that loyalty could shift like sand, and that even the most glorious victories could be accompanied by a murmur in the dark. When the Ides of March finally came and Caesar lay bleeding at the foot of Pompey's statue, no one mentioned Bithynia. The knives in his back were wielded for reasons far greater than an old rumor. But somewhere in the vast tapestry of his life, that scandal had shaped him, had taught him the necessity of vigilance, the value of image, and the danger of underestimating the cruelty of public opinion. The story of Caesar and Nicomedes was never erased from history. It remains 2,000 years later, not as proof of guilt or innocence, but as a testament to the truth that in politics perception can be as enduring and as deadly as fact.